All right, thanks so much, Sandy, and thanks everybody for joining today. It's exciting to talk to a group of retirees. Once you're retired, I think too often it seems like you're on cruise control and you don't engage necessarily as much with TRS, but there are topics that we think really are relevant to those particularly in the retired phase of their life. So it is a great pleasure to have you with us today. What we're going to talk about in the next 35 to 40 minutes are TRS death benefits. Now, your TRS benefit is payable through the month of your death. You cannot outlive that benefit. We have many members who have lived into their hundreds and have been retired even much longer than they actually contributed. So we do pay every single month for the rest of your death or for the rest of your life. But then what happens with TRS? Well, we're going to talk about that today. We'll talk about naming beneficiaries, the different types of beneficiaries that you can name, and how they are paid, what different benefits are available depending on your relationship to your beneficiary. There are actually more than one amounts that are payable at the time of your death. So we'll talk about those two amounts. One is a payout of any unrecovered pension contributions, anything that you may or not have recovered through the amounts that you receive as a monthly check. And then we'll talk about survivor benefits, which are funded separately and are paid in a different way, depending on who you name as your beneficiary. We'll talk about the claim process, what you need to do to enact a claim, or what someone needs to do on your passing to enact a claiming of death benefits. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end, which Sandy just explained. Now, I want to mention that TRS is a two-tier system. Most of our retirees are Tier 1, but we do have a handful of Tier 2 benefit recipients, Tier 2 retirees. The benefit that's payable on death from the Survivor Benefit Fund is different depending on if you were a Tier 1 or Tier 2 member. So we just want to make sure we delineate here that anybody who is Tier 1 started their active service in the state of Illinois public system prior to January 1 of 2011. If you began your public service career in Illinois after January 1 of 2011, you are considered Tier 2. So we hope that helps you to know where you fall within that two-tier system. Now, I think the death benefits really have to be explained in the context of the contributions that you made to TRS while you were working. So the normal contribution for many years has been 9%. Previous to that, it was 8%. But whether you were contributing 8% or 9%, most of your contributions were being set into your retirement bucket to be invested and to ultimately fund those first retirement checks that you receive as a retiree. But for everyone, 1 penny of every dollar that you ever earned, 1% of your earnings went into the survivor benefit bucket. And that is an amount that is held separately. It is not used to fund your pension checks, but is set aside to pay an eventual death benefit when you pass away. So while you are recovering your own contributions from the 8% retirement bucket, that 1% is just sitting there waiting to reach its potential to pay a benefit when you have passed away. So I want to talk about these two amounts of money and what happens with those amounts when you pass away. Now, we need you to tell us who you want to receive this money, because we're going to pay out any unrecovered pension contributions and any survivor benefit amounts based on your designation of beneficiaries. We do not recoup any of this. We don't absorb that into the TRS trust fund. These are your monies. They have your name on them. We have to put them out in either in your name as a retirement benefit or in the name of your beneficiaries when you pass away. So we need you to tell us who you want to get this money when you pass away. There's a couple of ways that you can name beneficiaries. One way is to use the automatic designation box. What's on your screen right now is kind of a mock-up of the TRS beneficiary designation form. Now, this form is used to tell TRS who you want to receive your monies when you pass. If you have checked the box in section 3 for automatic designation, it's right there on the screen. It's saying, I am electing that my dependent beneficiaries, as determined at the point of my death, receive a survivor benefit and or any beneficiary refund. That's the 8% bucket. If no dependent beneficiary survives, benefits will be paid to my estate. That's the estate of, fill in your name. The state of Illinois does not recoup any of this. This is not absorbed by TRS. Everything you've paid in is going to come back out either to you or to your beneficiaries. Now, the key word in this automatic designation is dependent. So if you have checked this box, at the point of your death, we're going to determine whether or not you had a spouse who is always considered your dependent as long as you've been married for at least a year. And if you don't have a spouse, we're going to determine if you had any other dependents, dependent children who are either under the age of 22, not married and still a full-time student. That's one definition of a dependent child. If you have a child who is dependent by virtue of a disability, they are often considered to be dependent for their lifetime, regardless of their age, if they have a permanent disability. So that is another definition of a dependent child. Also, if you have a dependent parent, this is fairly rare, but if you have a parent who depends upon you for at least 50% of their livelihood to where you could claim them on your taxes as a dependent, we can count them as a dependent beneficiary as well, but that's fairly rare. Again, typically it's just either going to be your spouse if you have one, if not, any dependent kids. So if you've checked this automatic designation box, we're going to pay in that order. So on your passing, if we indicate that you've checked the automatic designation, we're going to pay to your spouse if you have one. If there's no spouse, we would offer that benefit then to your dependent kids. And if none, then we would just write one check to your estate. That would then be subject to the provisions of your will, and then we would close the books. Now, that's kind of an easy way to keep up with changes to your dependent list. When someone is newly teaching and they have named the automatic designation, maybe they're unmarried, but then a couple years later they get married, well, the automatic designation accounts for the fact that they now have a spouse, such that if they were to pass away, even without that spouse being named, the spouse would be the automatic primary beneficiary under this designation. A couple years later, that person has a child or has a couple of kids. Well, those kids are now automatically in line to receive this benefit if the spouse of the deceased member has passed away. So this keeps up with those changes on the front end of your career. Toward the end of your career, as your kids are aging out of dependency because they're out of college and independent and no longer reliant on you for their income, they would no longer qualify as a dependent, which means that if there was one child left, maybe of your 3 children who was dependent, well, that child would be protected. They would be eligible to get that benefit through their college years, etc. But again, this is going to keep up with those changes. I'll mention also that if you have divorced or if your spouse has passed, this automatically accounts for that. This would get that individual off the list or out of the queue of people to receive that benefit because you no longer have that dependent relationship with that person. Now, that's one way to name beneficiaries. If you would instead rather go ahead and name beneficiaries by name, that's fine too. But you've got to name beneficiaries for each bucket, the 8% bucket, what we call the beneficiary refund, and then also the survivor benefits or the 1% bucket. I want to focus in on the survivor benefit bucket because that is typically where we're going to be paying benefits from when you pass away. I'll mention here that the 8% bucket, we're going to use that to fund your initial pension checks. So we're going to pay you your own monies back first. Now, as I mentioned, we pay for life, so you're never going to run out of money from TRS, but once your initial paychecks have emptied that 8% bucket to nothing, well, then we pay you out of the TRS trust fund for the rest of your life. So it's fairly common that there's nothing left in that 8% bucket when you pass away because you've recovered all of that money yourself. But the 1% bucket, as I've alluded, is always got the money in it. It's always just sitting there waiting for you to pass away so that we can use those dollars to pay a survivor benefit to your named beneficiaries for survivor benefits. Now, in the survivor benefit realm, who you name as beneficiary determines what we are able to pay from the bucket. So if you have named as a Tier 1 retiree, if you've named a spouse or a dependent child, TRS can pay a monthly benefit initially from the survivor benefit bucket that is 50% of your Tier 1 monthly pension at the date of your death. So if you were earning $6,000 a month as a pension, and you've named your Tier 1 spouse as your primary beneficiary, well, we would pay half of that $6,000 or $3,000 a month as a monthly benefit to that Tier 1 spouse or your Tier 1 dependent child. Now, spouses would receive this monthly benefit for their lifetime. Spouses can receive that benefit no matter how long they've been retired, or excuse me, how long they have been married to you, as long as it's at least 1 year. They would receive that for their lifetime, regardless of whether or not they remarry. So that is going to be payable for the life of the spouse. If your dependent child is your beneficiary, they're going to receive, as a Tier 1 retiree, their benefit is 50% of that benefit you were receiving in the month of your death. But they would only be eligible to receive that until they no longer meet all the criteria of the definition of a dependent. So if a child is a Tier 1 child, that means that as long as they are under 22, not married, and still a full-time student, they would qualify to receive that monthly benefit until they no longer meet all three criteria. If your dependent child is a disabled adult child, well, they would still continue to qualify based on their disability for their lifetime. So that benefit would be for the life of the disabled dependent child, as long as they're dependent by virtue of a permanent disability. So they would have to recertify that disability periodically. Now, for our Tier 2 members, if we have any with us today, Tier 2, your monthly benefit entitlement to a dependent is a little bit different. So when they wrote the Tier 2 legislation in 2010, they accounted for the fact that your increases in retirement are different. They're not as high. You don't receive as many increases in retirement typically as a Tier 2 person as you would Tier 1. So the growth of your benefit is a little bit slower. And so in your death benefit section for Tier 2, your spouse would be entitled to 2/3 of the benefit that you were receiving in the month of your death. So in the same scenario where you as a Tier 2 retiree are receiving $6,000 a month, that benefit to your spouse, your Tier 2 spouse, would be 66 2/3% or $4,000 of that $6,000 ending benefit. If you have a child listed as a dependent child listed as your primary beneficiary, if you're Tier 2, well, it's the same as Tier 1. It's 50% of that benefit to the dependent child. And again, the same definition of dependent child applies, both for those who are disabled and not disabled. Okay. Now, if you don't have a dependent beneficiary, there's two things that you should know. You should still list a beneficiary, and that beneficiary would still be entitled to an amount on your passing, but it would not be a monthly benefit. Monthly benefits are only available to those who are a dependent. They meet that legal definition of dependent. If you have a non-dependent listed, who is anyone who doesn't meet the definition of dependent, that can be your live-in significant other, where you don't have that legal marriage or that legal civil union relationship. You can name anybody you want to. So your live-in partner, your adult children, your non-dependent children, your nieces and nephews, your siblings. If you want to list a charity, you can name a charity, your church or the Humane Society. Anybody that you want to receive that monthly or that benefit, that one-time lump sum death benefit, can be listed. But again, that's only a lump sum. It's a one-time payment. It is taxable to whomever it is that you pay that. And then the other thing I want to mention is that if you have no dependent beneficiary, you are eligible to take a refund of your survivor benefit contributions or the contents of the 1% bucket while you are living. I have a feeling that of the 79 people who are in this webinar right now, several, their ears just perked up because they didn't necessarily know that. This isn't a secret. But if you have a dependent beneficiary at the point of your retirement, it's not really mentioned that you could take this refund if you at some point in your retirement find that you have no dependent beneficiary. So I bet one person at least from that list of 79 is going to call TRS this afternoon and request that refund. That is simply the amount that you have contributed to the Survivor Benefit Fund. So that's the contents of the 1% bucket. When we pay that out to you, it is taxable to you because those contributions came to us on a pre-tax basis. So you'd want to account for that. And we would also like you to think about the fact that if you've taken this 1% refund out and then you were to find a new spouse later, if Cupid were to strike in retirement, there would be nothing in that bucket that would go to fund a monthly benefit to your new spouse. So when you've taken this refund, that is permanent. There is no legal mechanism to repay that 1% survivor benefit refund that doesn't involve you returning to full-time active service, which most retirees do not choose to do. So just consider that also before you've taken that refund. But it is your money. We won't discourage you from taking it. We do want you to think about that you may have a future dependent beneficiary who could benefit from a monthly benefit. But no, if you call and you ask for a 1% survivor benefit refund application, we're going to send it out to you. And if you apply, we're going to write you the check. Okay. Now, that 8% bucket, while you typically don't see much being paid out of the 8% bucket when you pass, we do still want you to name a beneficiary if you have only recently retired. If you're, say, within the first 5 years of retirement, there's still an amount in that bucket. And if you were to pass away today, we need you to tell us who is going to get that money. If there's nobody listed, we'll just write a check to your estate, and that would be subject to the provisions of your will. But most people gain a lot of peace of mind from knowing that they have their beneficiaries listed and listed correctly. It's a good idea to just check your beneficiaries periodically, make sure you don't need to make any changes. In particular, if you have had a divorce or if your spouse has passed and you didn't have an alternate listed, it's just a good time to update those beneficiaries and make sure that the right people are there. We have to pay to the named beneficiary. So if you had a spouse and then that spouse divorced you, we would still have to pay that spouse unless you have changed your designation. They wouldn't get a monthly benefit, but we have to pay the named beneficiary, even if that's an ex-spouse. Now, claiming death benefits is really something that you're going to want to take note of so that you can relay this information to your loved ones or to your family so that they know what to do when the time comes that you have passed. So this really is a fairly streamlined process. We don't want to make the death benefit payout process any difficult at all. We don't want it to be an additional burden on your family who's already mourning your death. So all we ask is that somebody contact TRS and notify us of your passing. We simply need to know at that point, what was your date of death? And we need to know who to contact, to whom we need to send paperwork to apply for death benefits if they're payable. This can be anyone. You can, your spouse can call. If one of your kids wants to call, that's fine. If you have a caregiver, if you have an executor of your estate, we oftentimes will take these calls from someone from the funeral home. They'll call on your behalf as a courtesy to your family, and that's just kind of one less thing that you have to worry about. But you would just call the TRS toll-free number. We're going to have that on the screen at the end. But just make note, if you have that folder that says, hey, here's who needs to be called when I pass away, just make sure TRS is on that list. And again, it's just a quick phone call so that we can glean contact information and your date of death. TRS will then send paperwork out requesting documents from your next of kin. Of course, we need a death certificate. We need proof that you actually passed away on a particular date. And then we'll also send forms so that the survivors or those who are named as beneficiaries can report to us officially their address and contact phone, their email, etc., so that we can correspond with them directly, especially if there's multiple beneficiaries. We're going to send out those forms. If your beneficiary is a dependent, we're talking a spouse or a dependent child, we have to have some proof of dependency or a proof of that dependent relationship. For a spouse, we ask typically for a marriage certificate. That's not always easy to come by if you just don't have one and you got married in another state or in another county where you haven't lived for a long time. We can also accept in lieu of the marriage certificate last year's joint tax filing. So if you passed away today and your spouse doesn't have a marriage certificate, we can accept a copy of your 2023 joint tax filing in lieu of that. That just proves that dependent relationship. If your child is your named beneficiary, we're going to need a birth certificate. From any dependent beneficiary, we're going to need a copy of their ID to prove that this is, in fact, the individual to whom we should be paying. So we're just going to basically ask for documents initially to prove that dependent relationship or that we're talking to the right person, and of course, the proof that you have passed away. Now, once we get those initial documents back, we'll then calculate what benefits are available, either as a lump sum or as a monthly benefit to that dependent. And then we'll send out what's called an option letter or a survivor benefits election packet. Your spouse or other dependent can choose whether they want a monthly benefit or if they want that lump sum settlement of your survivor benefit contributions. Typically, if it's a spouse, they're going to take that monthly benefit for a couple reasons. One, typically that monthly benefit at a rate of 1/2 of your monthly benefit is going to pay out a lot more than just that one-time lump sum settlement from your survivor benefit bucket. But also, if a spouse is needing health insurance, the only way to access health insurance as a surviving dependent is to be in receipt of that monthly survivor benefit. So that's another layer of consideration for that spouse. Now, if it's a non-dependent beneficiary or beneficiaries plural with whom we're working, then it's just the lump sum, but we'll officially calculate that and send out then the death benefits election form so they can take that one-time lump sum. And that's also going to tell us how they want that money paid. Because this is a taxable amount, they can either choose to take that as a cash payment to themselves minus 20% tax, or they can roll that over to another tax shelter like an IRA, a 457 plan, any kind of a qualified plan that can receive monies from a 401A plan can accept a rollover of a lump sum death benefit. Now, death benefits, kind of like health insurance, always generate a lot of questions. It's kind of a nuanced thing. It depends on who is your beneficiary, or how many beneficiaries you have listed and their relationship to you. So I just want to cover a few frequently asked questions that may thin out the Q&A box. But does my spouse's benefit continue if they remarry? Yes, it does. If a spouse is receiving a monthly survivor benefit, they are entitled to receive that monthly benefit for their lifetime, with no impact based on their remarriage. So they could remarry 3 times and they would still continue to receive this monthly benefit from TRS, because that survivor benefit is set up to pay the spouse for life. Question 2, does my dependent beneficiary receive annual increases? Yes, if they are receiving a monthly benefit, a monthly survivor benefit, they would continue to receive the same annual increase that you were receiving while you were living. That's another tier 1, tier 2 difference, but that's pretty well defined. And whatever you are receiving as an increase annually is the same increase that would be applicable to a monthly survivor benefit. Can my surviving dependents get trip and trail health insurance? Yes, provided you were eligible as the retiree. Whether or not you were enrolled, if you were eligible as the retiree, that monthly benefit recipient is also entitled to trip and trail enrollment if they elect it. So that's optional health insurance to them. Do I have to list my spouse, or can I list my adult kids as beneficiaries? No, you don't have to list anyone. You are entirely in control of who you name as beneficiary. If you have named your spouse, the spouse is typically eligible for that monthly benefit, whereas your adult children are not. So again, the amount that's payable from the system as a monthly benefit is likely going to exceed the amount that's payable as a lump sum within just a few months. So consider that. I'm not trying to sway you toward naming your spouse if that's not what you want to do. But we do want to make you aware that there are different amounts payable depending on your relationship to that beneficiary. It's not uncommon that if someone has a second marriage, that they will go ahead and keep their adult children from their first marriage as their primary beneficiaries, and that's fine. We're going to pay to the named beneficiary, but again, there is that monthly benefit that's available if you name the dependent spouse as your primary beneficiary. How do you go about changing your beneficiaries? Well, you just need to complete a new beneficiary designation form. Just call us up for that. We're happy to send one out to you with a return envelope. And that's how you would update your beneficiaries. When you log into your online account on trsil.org, you can see who you've got named as beneficiary. So if you're not certain, that's probably the quickest way to see who you're listing currently and whether or not that needs to be changed. And then the final FAQ is, if I take a refund of my survivor benefit contributions, can I pay it back if Cupid strikes? No, not in an easy way. If you have taken that survivor benefit refund, that's an irrevocable election, essentially. But if you did remarry and you were inclined to want to reinstate that amount so that there could be that monthly benefit available for a new spouse, the only way to do that would be for you to return to active service. Once you have exceeded the post-retirement work limit, which is currently 120 days, you would start accruing service credit again. You'd have to start contributing to TRS again as an active member. And then once you have worked 170 days beyond that post-retirement work limit, then you would be considered reactivated and therefore eligible to reinstate your survivor benefit refund. So you'd have to then repay what we had paid out to you, plus the interest those monies would have accrued from the time you took them out at a rate of 6% compounded annually. But that is the only way to reinstate your survivor benefit contribution, is to unretire. On the screen right now is the TRS contact information. If you have contact, or if you have questions for TRS regarding your death benefits, or who you've got listed as beneficiary, or what might be payable either to your beneficiaries or to you as a survivor benefit refund, give a call. 877-927-5877 on the right-hand side there. We're available today until 4:30 and from 8:30 to 4:30 tomorrow, and every Monday through Friday. And that is what we do, is we, myself and my 7 best friends down the hall here, our 12-member service reps and our 8 counselors in Lisle, that is what we do, is we answer those inquiries as they come in by phone or email. Speaking of email, as Sandy mentioned, there's an email address on the left-hand side of the screen, and that is where you can contact us if you would like a written response to your questions. We always have a benefits counselor who mans the email box, so they can typically get you a written response within 1 business day. Just below that is the TRS website, trsil.org. tons of information, general information there on the public-facing portion of our website, but that is also the portal to your online account. So if you are wanting to dive in there and see who you've got listed as beneficiaries, or as a retiree, that's how you would see what's being paid to you. Gross, net, and deductions are all itemized there. You can print your monthly earnings statement or your annual earnings statement. You can request replacement tax forms and do all kinds of things right there through your online account 24/7. Below that are the TRS Facebook and Twitter IDs. If you would like to follow us on Facebook or Twitter, it's a great place to just take some kind of periodic passive updates on what's going on at TRS, either legislatively or regarding new programs. When there's an upcoming health insurance open enrollment, we put that information out there as well. Just below that is the TRS YouTube channel address. And that is where you would see a recorded version of today's webinar and numerous other webinars. We've recorded all of our 4 webinars today, so you can see recorded sessions there, as well as some shorter videos about things like how to fill out your beneficiary form, or just death benefits in general. There's great information out there for visual learners like myself, so I always appreciate being able to watch a video. Sandy, I'm going to leave this contact information on the screen as we address any questions that have come in. It looks like there are some questions in the Q&A box. Have you selected any for sharing?
I have indeed. Thank you, Nick. Great job.
Thanks.
The first one is, it's a great thing that we're doing this because things have changed since people retired. The first question is, can I designate a beneficiary without giving a social security number? That was not on the old form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a change to the most recent form, which was, I think, a 2022 change. And that really just made it easier for us to find people or to know that we were working with the correct person. You'd be surprised at how many people have a spouse and a child with the exact same name. So that helps us to know exactly who it is that we're working with. But yes, you can name your beneficiaries and leave that section blank. If you don't have that person's social or just don't care to include it there, that's totally fine. Additionally, if you are listing an entity as opposed to an individual, for example, if you are listing a charity, your church, for example, there'd be nothing to indicate there. You don't have to indicate a tax ID number or anything there. You can just leave that blank if you don't know it or don't care to include it. But we will accept the form without it.
All right. Does a spouse's social security have anything to do with them being able to collect a survivor benefit?
No. If your spouse is receiving a Social Security benefit, there is no negative impact on their available TRS survivor benefits, nor would there be any negative impact on their Social Security for them receiving that TRS benefit. So no, those two do not negatively impact each other at all.
Very good. Adult children can only receive survivor benefits, not anything from the beneficiary refund. So just kind of clarify maybe what is available. And I'm going to say they're thinking adult children, that not disabilities, just adult children.
Okay. When we're talking about the beneficiary refund or the 8% bucket, it doesn't matter who you list there. Anyone can receive that amount, and it's always going to be the same amount no matter who you list or their relationship to you, because that's always just a cash out lump sum of any unrecovered pension contributions. So you can name anybody you want there, and it doesn't even have to be the same people that you name as your survivor benefit beneficiaries. But no, we can pay to anybody. It doesn't matter on the 8% bucket if they are young or old, dependent or otherwise. We can pay anybody, and they would only receive that lump sum. Keep in mind, though, it's rare that we would pay anything out of the 8% bucket. If you've been retired for at least 5 years, you've typically at that point recovered everything that was in that bucket plus. But again, we only would typically pay anything out of 8% if you were a newer retiree, or heaven forbid, if you were still active when you passed, there would be money there for sure. But no, that doesn't matter who you list. We can pay anybody. On the survivor benefits side, of course, which side of the dependent line you fall on is going to determine whether or not we can pay a monthly or a lump sum.
Very good. Nick, I'm going to put a couple questions together and just explain it because it has to do with adult children with disabilities.
Sure.
And rather than going into so much detail on the questions, I think generally what people are looking for is, how do you determine whether or not someone would qualify as an adult child, if you will, with a disability? And then how does that all work? So a couple things I can coach you on here. One is, as you know, when you have a child with a disability, everything is quite individualized. So probably the best thing to do is contact TRS and explain the specific situation, and we can kind of walk through that with you. What will happen is, to qualify as an adult disabled child to get a monthly benefit, they need to be dependent on your taxes at the time you retire, and you need two physicians to say that they are unable to earn a living on their own. That is sort of the basis for determining that at the time of your death. The monthly benefit can be paid to a special needs trust. Someone asked about an ABLE account. It cannot be paid to that. Can be paid to a special needs trust. That is the only type of trust that can get a monthly benefit. And it does require a little bit of special wording in there. So this is a situation I am quite familiar with, so I understand the questions about this. And then, not related to this topic at all, is how you also can extend health insurance. So really what you would want to do, if this is your situation, I would suggest that you call TRS and we can sort of figure out where you are in the process and what you have set up. And we will let you know what your options are for there. So that is probably the best way to handle that situation. What is the typical turnaround time for dependents to get their first monthly benefit?
Thanks for that question. Really, it just depends on how long it takes for the paperwork to come back to TRS. When you are talking about a monthly benefit that's going to be payable to that spouse, ideally, we're going to get everything turned around within 1 month. We don't like for there to be a gap in income. I'd like to mention here that when you pass away, if you are living for any portion of that month, we pay at the end of that month for the entirety of that month. So if someone were to pass away on March the 5th, because they lived at least a few days into the month of March, if they live even 1 day into the month of March, they are entitled to their entire March pension payable on April 1. And that buys the survivor a little bit of time, because that means that we're going to go ahead and pay at the end of April, and ideally during those first few, or excuse me, at the 1st of April for the month of March. So ideally during March, we've had the at least initial exchange of paperwork done with that survivor. It can take a minute to get together all of the documents that we request. Again, that marriage certificate may not be readily available. Even your tax forms may not be easy to put your hand on it right away. But again, we would like for there to be no gap in income. Even if there is a delay in getting the paperwork exchanged and that initial survivor benefit check issued, whenever it is that that initial check is paid, we're going to pay retroactive to the date that it became effective, which would be the 1st of the month after that individual died. So in the scenario where someone expires or passes away on March the 5th, we're going to pay on April 1 the full amount of that March pension, and then we're going to pay on the 1st of May for April the 1/2 monthly benefit, or the 2/3 monthly benefit if it's a tier 2 person. So we would like for that all to happen very fluid, so that there is no gap. But if there was a delay, if we didn't get a May 1 check issued to the survivor for the month of April, well, then on June the 1st, we'd pay for all of May and all of April on June the 1st. So you are always made whole. Even if there is a delay in paperwork, that doesn't mean you're going to ultimately miss out on any benefit that's payable. But ideally, a short answer to your question, I'd say, is ideally 30 days.
There you go. A couple people have asked this in varying forms. Can you take your survivor benefit when you still have a dependent living, most likely a spouse? So if you are still married.
Okay. Yeah, that's an easy one. No, you cannot. If you have anyone, even if you don't consider your spouse to be dependent because they have a high income and wouldn't need that amount, no. You would have to certify under penalty of perjury that you do not have a spouse or a dependent child, anyone who meets the definition of dependent by TRS standards, before we could pay you that refund.
All righty. Where do you find the amount of the 1% survivor benefit? Does that grow over time? Does it grow interest?
You would need to contact TRS to learn the amount of your 1% survivor benefit refund, and it is static. Once you have stopped contributing, then you're no longer going to see growth to that number. So if you have, for example, $15,000 in your survivor benefit fund the day that you retire, and then 20 years later, you call TRS and say, hey, my spouse has died. I have no other dependents. I'd like to take that refund. It's still going to be $15,000. So no, it is not growing as it sits. If you were inclined to take it, you would want to take that soon, I would say, if your concern is that you're not getting any growth on it.
All right. And one other question in here, do you need to list your husband or a spouse in order to get the monthly benefit?
No, if you have indicated the first option we discussed, which was the automatic designation, spouse is entitled to a monthly benefit if they qualify as that dependent spouse under your automatic designation. But if you list them, then yes, of course they would receive that. If you list somebody else, then no, the spouse would not receive anything. The spouse has to be named in order to receive something, or they're going to have to be the qualifier under that automatic designation. But if you list your kids, your spouse isn't going to get anything.
There you go. All right.
Sandy, I want to dial back if I could, because
Sure.
you had mentioned something interesting that I really thought was worth addressing when you were talking about the disabled adult child, and that was the word trust. We mentioned that, you can name a charity, you can name, if you name no one, it would just be payable to your estate. But it is not uncommon that folks will indicate the trust. If they have an irrevocable trust in their own name, the Sandra Benhart Irrevocable Living Trust or something like that, you can name a trust. But I do want to clarify, because Sandy mentioned that we can pay a monthly benefit to a special needs trust. That is the only instance where we can pay a monthly benefit to a trust. So if you have a spouse, and even if the spouse is the beneficiary of your trust, we cannot pay a monthly benefit to a trust. So you can list your trust if you want to, but we're only going to be able to pay a lump sum to that trust unless it's a special needs trust. Now, one other thing then, as Sandy mentioned, that we can pay a monthly benefit to a special needs trust. When you name a special needs trust or are thinking about naming your special needs trust, we're going to ask you to submit to TRS a copy of that trust so that our legal department can assure that the language is correct to allow us to pay a monthly benefit to that trust. Because obviously, if your intent is to get that monthly benefit out there for the benefit of your adult disabled child, you'd want to make airtight certain that that language is correct in order for us to be able to do that. And that's all I had to say about trust, but I'm glad you brought it up.
Yes, that is. Sometimes that's a question that people will have. They'll have a trust and not a special needs trust, and may have their spouse within that trust. That is not going to work. You need in order to get a monthly benefit, it has to be a person's name outside that special needs trust. So I'm glad you went back and clarified that. Sometimes that will come up. So that is all the questions that we have. Thank you very much for attending. Anything you'd like to add, Nick?
Only to kind of reiterate what you just said, and that's thank you very much for engaging with this first round of retiree webinars. Really, that's what made it successful, was that we had people who logged in and engaged and took took advantage of the Q&A box. So often it's the Q&A session that kind of brings out better or deeper understanding of what it is that we have presented, because it kind of highlights those unique situations or those kind of nuanced elements of what we have presented. So I thank you very much. And again, I thank you in advance for your feedback. I think Sandy and I are just so pleased that we had such a good response today, that we're going to be excited to get that next round of retiree webinars going. So watch your inbox as we have new topics to present. We hope you'll tune in again. So thanks very much for joining today.
All right. Thanks, everyone.